Before I was born, my mother and father grew up in the same suburban neighborhood. The year for them when this started was 1993, and they were about 12 or 13 years old. And during that time, they would always spend their summers outside since it would be too hot to be parked inside reading comics or playing with toys. My parents would play on the block with a whole bunch of kids, but the ones that stuck out were Nicole, Manny, and Lee. These were the close friends of both my parents, and they did pretty much everything together. The summer of '93 was extremely hot according to my mom, so she and the rest of the group were playing with water guns and water balloons to cool off. My dad remembered that Lee stopped what he was doing and turned his head to see a bright white ice cream truck playing the Mr. Softy song and slowly creeping up on the street. In that moment, a bunch of kids came out with their $5 bills in hand and went up to the radiant truck. With their wide smiles and high-pitched demands for single cones, popsicles, and snow cones, they all rushed the truck in happiness. My parents, Nicole and Manny, went inside to ask their parents for money, while Lee made his way to grab some water. As he was walking though, he noticed the truck getting ready to leave as quick as when it arrived. But what was strange about the whole thing was that the kids that were by the truck were nowhere to be seen. When he looked over to the window spot, it was like they all just vanished. The only thing Lee saw was the ice cream man, giving off a friendly smile in his direction, and in the next minute he shut his window door with a slam before slowly driving away. He stood there on that empty street alone and petrified. When my parents, Nicole and Manny, finally came outside and saw Lee, and called out to him, but he still just stood there like he was in a trance. He only pointed his finger towards the direction of where the ice cream truck headed and didn't say a word. A few hours later, the police were called for the children that mysteriously disappeared at that truck, and all Lee kept telling them was, it was the smiling ice cream man. The next few weeks after that incident, no kids were found at all, and life continued on normally for my parents and their friends. There were different ice cream trucks coming and going, but Lee wouldn't ever go to them because of what he saw. It was the middle of August and summer was winding down. My parents and their friends were staying out more late than usual outside, riding bikes in their neighborhood when they heard the Mr. Softy jingle again. This time everyone had their own money due to chores or other jobs around the neighborhood. My dad told me the sun was setting, but it was so humid that day that they literally rushed over to the truck on their bikes to get anything that was cold to help themselves too. The only one who was hesitant was Lee, because he knew that the ice cream truck was sketchy. He still went over to keep an eye on his friends, but when he got over there he made sure to keep his distance. When everyone put their bikes on the curb and lined up by the truck window, everything looked fine to Lee. Everyone was getting their ice cream, but he noticed that the man dropped my mom's ice cream and apologized as he closed the window to go fetch another one. At that moment, Lee knew that it was time to go, and he didn't waste any time trying to warn everyone either. "Robbie, let's just go to my house. I got a bunch of ice cream and crap. We don't need this truck." Lee nudged my dad and whispered to him, while giving him an obvious, "It's about to go down" look in his eye according to my dad. My dad, however, was telling Lee that he was just paranoid and he waved him off. Lee at that moment tried again, but this time pulled my dad and told him again, more seriously. My dad apparently was about to push him off when Lee told my dad about what had happened the day that the kids had disappeared. "You remember when I was talking about the smiling ice cream man? Well, this is him," Lee told my dad in a hushed tone, so he wouldn't arouse suspicion. My dad then walked over to my mom and tried to get her to back away from the truck. but they weren't fast enough. The ice cream man came back to the window and called out to my mom, "Aren't you forgetting your ice cream?" My mom brushed off my dad's arm and walked over to get her cone, but she didn't notice the sprayer in the man's other hand. In one swift motion, he put the sprayer up to my mom's face, and before Manny, Nicole, or Lee could pull her and my dad back, they all got hit by the gas, and after a few coughing fits, all of them fell to the ground and blacked out. My parents apparently remember waking up in a poorly lit room that was only illuminated by a weak and flickering bulb. My dad was the first awake, seeing Manny and Nicole chained to the walls and Lee tied up in a chair next to my mom. My dad quickly looked around the room and saw some of the kids from a few weeks ago, but not in the way that he wanted to. They were hardly put together like they should be. It was, to be put lightly, as my dad called it, a horror show. He started to panic and scream, but realized that his mouth was gagged and saw that the others were too. He could hear steps coming down the stairs, creaking more and more the closer that they got. He saw the ice cream man, but this time it's as if the man became something more sinister, something darker. The man's smile was twisted into a wide, malicious grin, and his eyes gave off no glint or any form of light. The clean white uniform shirt and his khaki slacks were replaced with a smock with dried-up bloodstains marking it like a tie-dye shirt. In his hand, he was holding a large hunting knife that looked dangerously sharp and well-polished, that had started to reflect brightly off the dim light. He walked over to my mother and lifted up her chin with his hand. "I'm gonna have some fun with you before I snap that pretty little light out of you," he said with a greasy smile. My dad had tried to struggle out of his restraints to help my mom, but the ropes were too strong for him to get out of. The man then walked over to Lee and looked at him with intensity in his eyes. "You, this could have been so much easier if you didn't open your mouth." Following his slightly hushed voice was a swift right hook aimed right for Lee's cheek. My dad heard his cheek give a loud crack and his muffled grunts behind the gag. He could see Lee starting to have tears in his eyes, but gave the evil adult a defiant look and stared him down. "Oh, you think you got guts, kid? We'll see." The man started to laugh maliciously as he walked over to Manny and ran the knife lightly across his throat, as he brought it to the cloth gag and gave it an easy slice. "So, kid, your friend over there thinks he's tough. You want to prove him wrong?" He put the knife up to Manny's cheek and gave it a light cut. "Help us! We're stuck in here, help!" Manny tried to call out to anyone at all, but all the vile man did was laugh hysterically. "Screw you!" And with that, Manny headbutted the man in the nose. The man stammered back and held his bleeding nose in his hand. My dad noticed that his eyes were more malicious and full of contempt after that hit, and then an awkward silence filled the room. The man looked at Manny with a deadpan, soulless stare, and flashed that friendly smile he showed us hours ago. And then, in that moment, he ran up to Manny and jabbed him in the stomach. My dad tried to get out of his restraints to help, but the ropes were knotted too tight. My parents had to watch in horror as their friend was brutally gutted, to the point where it was everywhere on the man. The man rubbed it on his face and let out a deep exhale. He walked over to a cabinet in the room and pulled out a scalpel and slowly walked over to Nicole. The thumps were the only thing echoing in the room, as Lee and my parents looked in despair as he walked up to her and held the scalpel right over her left eye. He then brushed the hair out of her face and hovered the scalpel dangerously close to her pupil. "Your eyes," the man said as he started to breathe frantically. Nicole tried to struggle, but the man held her head firmly on the wall, staring deeply into her eyes as he waved the blade over them. They just look so pure and full of hope. He looked over to Lee and then said, "You still got guts, kid?" With that remark, the man raised his arm back, getting ready to use it. Nicole tried to shake her head to move out of the way, but it was hopeless as her eye was pierced, and the man smiled widely in glee. He took off the gag so that he could hear her cry even more. The remaining group watched with tears running down their cheeks. My dad recalled trying to fray the ropes even more to help, but it seemed like he didn't need to, as he heard footsteps rushing down the stairs quickly. Due to these street cams on the spotlights, the police were called, and they came to the house where the truck was parked at, and went down to the basement. They all had their weapons drawn as they saw the man picking out Nicole's eye, and looking at the officers with an evil and sadistic smile. The officers screamed at him to put his hands up, but he just kept walking slowly towards them. And that's when my dad heard the gunshots and saw the man getting hit. He still kept moving with each shot, and started to raise his hunting knife to strike, while gurgling in excitement due to his wounds. The officers finally put him down, and the man fell back onto the ground, never to move again. Years passed, and my parents alongside with Lee and Nicole never really got over the situation, and they still felt like Malcolm and I weren't safe in the neighborhood. I wish I could say that they were wrong. I really wish I could. The legend, however, still reigns true to this day, and here's how it goes. Every summer onward after the incident, you could hear the Mr. Softy jingle in the neighborhood in the middle of the night. It gets louder and louder the more you try to ignore it. If you look out the window to see what's causing the sound, you will see an ice cream truck in the shadows with a figure looking out of it. If you look into his red eyes, you will walk towards his truck and be taken away and vanish. Malcolm and I didn't believe in it because it sounded crazy at first, but then it made sense. A lot of kids who went missing after the incident apparently sneaked out, and no traces of a struggle was noted. This means that most of the kids had been targeted by that song, due to one kid being lucky enough to get restrained by his dad. As soon as he had snapped out of his trance, he looked around scared, asking if the song had stopped. However, I was sadly still skeptical because some of the kids that were targeted had histories of mental illnesses and issues like psychosis, so it got hard to believe in after a while. We talked about it one night over the phone, and he was understandably scared. What if we start hearing that stuff? My mom lost her eyebrow. His voice got a little shaky. I don't want to end up like that man. I reassured him that everything would be fine, and that the man that did all that had been long gone. I told him that nothing would happen to him since we literally live right across the street from each other, and he would call me if something happens. With that, we both called it a night and went to sleep. I had a dream where I was walking down some steps leading down to a dim light. As I walked towards it, I could smell something decaying, and as I reached the end of the steps, the light brightened up the entire room. There were kids everywhere. I guess you could call them kids, but you could hardly recognize them. I tried my hardest not to throw up, and as I looked around, I noticed him. The man was in the back of the basement at a table, sharpening his knife. He stopped suddenly and slowly turned to meet my eyes. He flashed that wide and malicious grin that I only heard about in recalls from my parents. With a laugh, he charged towards me, ready to strike, and as I put my hands out to guard myself, I woke up. I caught my breath, telling myself in my head that I was okay and I was alive. Stupid freaking story, I told myself as I pulled up the covers and turned on my phone to ease my mind with YouTube. As I put in my passcode, I heard a song that sounded all too familiar. It was the jingle of an ice cream truck, and it was getting louder and louder by the minute. It turns out the legend was true after all.